In the suffocating heat of summer 1860, deep in the cotton fields of Liberty County, Georgia, a 10-year-old enslaved black boy named Isaac Collins touched the burning forehead of a dying man and whispered words that no one could quite hear. Within hours, the man's fever broke. Within a day, he was walking. Within a week, he was back in the fields, alive, when every medical prediction said he should be dead. This was not the first time Isaac Collins had done the impossible. And it would not be the last. While typhoid fever, smallpox, and scarlet fever ravaged plantations throughout the South, killing children and adults with terrifying regularity, Isaac Collins never got sick. Not once. Not ever. In an era when 36% of enslaved children died before reaching their 10th birthday, when simple infections became death sentences, when medicine consisted of bloodletting and mercury tonics that often killed faster than the diseases they were meant to treat, Isaac Collins stood as an impossible anomaly. A child who not only never fell ill himself, but who could cure others with nothing more than the touch of his hands and words spoken so softly that witnesses could never quite remember what he said. Dr. Milton Grant, a Union Army physician who examined Isaac in 1866, wrote in his confidential military report, "This boy defies every principle of medical science I have been taught. His body temperature rises during the healing process, then drops below normal human range before stabilizing. The patients he touches recover from fevers that should have been fatal. I have witnessed this with my own eyes, measured it with my own instruments, and I cannot explain it. If this capability could be understood and replicated, it would revolutionize medicine. But I fear that understanding may be beyond the reach of current science." Dr. Grant's report was filed as Phenomenon 72 Collins in the Union Army's Medical Curiosities Archive, a collection of unusual medical cases observed during and after the Civil War. The report disappeared from official records in 1874, just 6 years after Isaac Collins himself vanished without a trace from the Georgia plantation where he had been born and enslaved. No death certificate was ever filed. No grave was ever marked. No definitive record exists of what became of the boy who could cure fevers without medicine, who never got sick himself, whose very existence seemed to violate the laws of biology and disease. But fragments of his story survive, recorded in the journals of a former enslaved midwife named Ruth Henderson, documented in testimonies given to the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War, preserved in the fading memories of people who witnessed Isaac's impossible healings and carried those memories into old age. These fragments, when pieced together, reveal a story that is simultaneously miraculous and tragic. A story about a black boy with an extraordinary gift living in a world that viewed black people as property rather than as human beings capable of possessing abilities that exceeded white understanding. This is not just a story about healing. This is a story about the burden of gifts that cannot be controlled or understood, about the isolation that comes from being fundamentally different from everyone around you, about the price of using your abilities to help others when every healing takes something from you that can never be fully recovered. This is a story about a boy who could warm life back into dying bodies, but who was never allowed to live a warm life himself, who spent his brief time on earth touching others while desperately trying to avoid being touched, who saved dozens of lives, but couldn't save himself from disappearing into historical silence. Before we continue with Isaac Collins' story and his mysterious gift, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our videos about unexplained Black American history. Tell us in the comments which state or city you're listening from and whether you've ever heard stories in your family about healers whose abilities seem to defy medicine. Isaac Collins was born in the spring of 1850 on the Whitfield Plantation in Liberty County, Georgia, one of the largest cotton-growing operations in the state. His mother, Sarah Collins, was a field worker who died during childbirth, her body simply unable to survive the combination of hard labor, poor nutrition, and the physical trauma of delivery. The midwife who delivered Isaac, a woman named Ruth Henderson, would later record in her private journal that the birth was unusual from the very beginning. The baby came out not crying like most babies do. Ruth wrote in an entry dated March 1850, "He came out quiet and calm, his eyes already open, already looking around like he was studying the world he'd just entered. His skin was warm, warmer than any newborn I'd ever touched. Not feverish warm, but like he had some kind of heat inside him that other babies didn't have. His mama died within the hour, her body just giving out after the effort of bringing him into the world. But that baby, he never cried for her. He just looked at everything with those dark eyes, taking it all in, like he already understood that this world wasn't going to be kind to him." Isaac was raised collectively by the enslaved community on the Whitfield plantation, passed from cabin to cabin, cared for by women who had lost their own children or who had room in their hearts for one more mouth to feed. He was a quiet child, remarkably so, speaking very little even as he grew old enough to form words. But what he lacked in verbal communication, he made up for in observation. He watched everything, the way people moved when they were healthy versus when they were getting sick. The subtle changes in skin color and breathing patterns that preceded fever, the way illness seemed to spread through the slave quarters in predictable patterns following contaminated water sources or spoiled food. Ruth Henderson, who had taken primary responsibility for Isaac's care, noticed something extraordinary about the boy when he was around 5 years old. "The child never got sick," she recorded in her journal in 1855. "We had a terrible outbreak of fever that summer. Looked like typhoid based on the symptoms, though we didn't have proper doctors to diagnose these things accurately. 12 people in the quarters fell ill. 3 died, including 2 children younger than Isaac. But Isaac, who was sleeping in the same cabin with infected people, who was drinking the same water and eating the same food, never showed a single symptom. He would sit beside the sick people, watching them with those studying eyes of his, but the fever never touched him. It was like his body had some kind of shield around it that sickness couldn't penetrate." The other enslaved people on the plantation began to notice Isaac's unusual immunity as well. They whispered about it in the evenings, sharing observations and theories. Some believed Isaac had been blessed by God, that his mother's death during his birth had somehow transferred her life force into him, making him stronger than ordinary children. Others thought he might have inherited protection from African ancestors, that old spiritual powers had marked him as special. A few feared him, wondering if his immunity meant he carried sickness without showing symptoms, like a vessel that held disease but never suffered from it. The first recorded healing occurred in the fall of 1855, when Isaac was 5 years old. A young man named Robert Hale, who worked in the fields alongside Isaac's adoptive caregivers, developed a severe fever that lasted 3 days. His temperature soared so high that he became delirious, speaking nonsense and thrashing in his bed. Ruth Henderson tried every remedy she knew: cool compresses, herbal teas made from willow bark and feverfew, prayers and poultices, but nothing brought the fever down. By the 3rd night, Robert was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored, and Ruth believed he would be dead by morning. Isaac, who had been watching Robert's decline with his characteristic intense observation, approached the sick man's bedside late that night. Without saying anything to Ruth or the other adults present, he reached out and placed his small hand on Robert's burning forehead. Ruth would later describe what happened next in testimony given to a Freedmen's Bureau interviewer in 1888, more than 30 years after the event. "The child put his hand on Robert's head, and I swear I felt the temperature in the room change. It got warmer, like someone had opened an oven door. Isaac closed his eyes and stood perfectly still for what seemed like forever, but was probably only a minute or 2. Then he opened his eyes, looked at Robert, and said in this quiet voice, 'Not his time yet. The fever is leaving.' And then the strangest thing happened. Robert stopped thrashing. His breathing got deeper and more regular. The tension went out of his body. and he fell into what looked like natural sleep instead of the fitful unconsciousness he'd been in. By morning, his fever had broken completely. By afternoon, he was sitting up and asking for food. Within 2 days, he was back to work, like nothing had ever been wrong with him. Ruth questioned Isaac about what he had done, but the 5-year-old boy couldn't or wouldn't explain. "I just knew the fever was ready to leave," he told her. "I could feel it wanting to go, so I helped it go." Ruth didn't know what to make of this explanation, but she filed it away in her memory along with all the other strange things she had observed about Isaac Collins. The enslaved community's reaction to Robert Hale's recovery was mixed. Some were grateful, viewing Isaac's intervention as a miracle that had saved a valued member of their community. Others were unsettled, uncertain whether what Isaac had done was natural or something else entirely. Robert himself was confused about his recovery. "I remember burning up," he told Ruth a few days later. "I remember feeling like I was dying. Then I felt this cool hand on my forehead, and it was like the hand was pulling the heat out of me, drawing it away. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, the fever was gone. That boy did something to me. I don't know what, but he did something." Over the next 2 years, Isaac performed several more healings, always quietly, always without fanfare or explanation. A child with a dangerous fever would recover after Isaac touched her. An elderly man with pneumonia would suddenly improve after Isaac sat beside him for an hour. A woman with an infection that was spreading through her body would find the infection receding after Isaac placed his hands over the affected area. Each time, the pattern was the same. Isaac would touch the sick person. The room would grow warmer. Isaac would close his eyes in concentration, and then the patient would begin to recover far faster than natural healing would predict. Ruth Henderson began keeping informal notes about these healings, recording names and dates in the margins of her personal journal. She didn't understand what Isaac was doing, but she recognized that it was extraordinary and worth documenting. "The boy has a gift," she wrote in 1857. "I don't know if it comes from God or from something else, but it's real. I've seen it work too many times to dismiss it as coincidence. Somehow, some way, Isaac can make fevers leave bodies. He can make infections retreat. He can pull sickness out of people like you'd pull weeds out of a garden. And he never gets sick himself. It's like sickness can't live in him, and when he touches sick people, he convinces the sickness that it can't live in them either." The second healing that attracted significant attention from the white community occurred in 1857, when Isaac was 7 years old. This time, the patient was someone who couldn't be ignored or explained away as a simple recovery from natural illness. It was Eleanor Whitfield, the 8-year-old daughter of Thomas Whitfield, the plantation owner. Eleanor had contracted what the family physician diagnosed as scarlet fever, a highly contagious and often fatal disease that produced high fever, sore throat, and a characteristic rash. For 4 days, Eleanor burned with fever that climbed higher each day, despite the best efforts of Dr. Samuel Hutchinson, the most respected physician in Liberty County. Dr. Hutchinson tried everything in his considerable medical arsenal: bleeding to release the bad humors, mercury tonics to purge the system, opium tinctures to bring down the fever, cold baths to reduce body temperature. Nothing worked. Eleanor's fever continued to rise, her body weakened, and by the 4th night, Dr. Hutchinson privately told Thomas Whitfield that his daughter was unlikely to survive until morning. The fever had reached a level that typically preceded death, and there was nothing more medical science could do. In desperation, and perhaps influenced by rumors that had spread through the plantation about Isaac's healing of Robert Hale and several other enslaved people in the intervening years, Thomas Whitfield ordered that the boy be brought to his daughter's bedside. It was an extraordinary breach of social protocol, bringing an enslaved child into the master's house to attempt a healing when a white physician had declared the case hopeless. But parental desperation overrides social convention, and Whitfield was willing to try anything to save his daughter's life. Isaac was brought to Eleanor's bedroom late that night. Ruth Henderson accompanied him, brought along as much to supervise the boy as to bear witness to what would happen. Dr. Hutchinson was also present, skeptical and somewhat offended that his medical expertise was being superseded by what he viewed as plantation superstition. Thomas Whitfield stood at the foot of his daughter's bed, his wife Eleanor Sr. weeping quietly in a chair by the window. According to all accounts, Ruth's journal, Dr. Hutchinson's later notes, and Thomas Whitfield's own statement given years later, what happened next was both subtle and extraordinary. Isaac approached the bedside slowly, his young face serious and focused. He didn't speak to anyone in the room or ask permission to proceed. He simply reached out and placed both of his hands on Eleanor's forehead, which was burning with fever so intense that Ruth later said it hurt to touch the child's skin. Isaac stood perfectly still, his hands on Eleanor's head, his eyes closed in concentration. The room fell silent, except for Eleanor's labored breathing and her mother's quiet weeping. Then, according to all witnesses, the temperature in the room changed. Dr. Hutchinson noted in his records that he felt a wave of warmth wash over him, as if someone had lit a large fire in the room, though the fireplace held only dying embers. Ruth Henderson wrote that she felt heat radiating from Isaac's body, heat that seemed unnatural for a 7-year-old child. Isaac stood like that for approximately 5 minutes, his hands never moving from Eleanor's forehead. Then he opened his eyes, looked at the fevered girl with an expression of deep concentration, and spoke in a voice that Ruth described as older than his years, like an adult speaking through a child's mouth. "The fever is stubborn," Isaac said. "It doesn't want to leave, but it's not strong enough to stay. I'm asking it to go now." He paused, his eyes unfocused as if he were seeing something invisible to everyone else in the room. "It's leaving. The heat is going out of her and into the air. By morning, she'll sleep naturally. By tomorrow afternoon, she'll wake and ask for food. By the day after, she'll want to play. This is what will happen." Isaac removed his hands from Eleanor's forehead and stepped back. As he did so, Ruth noticed that the boy looked exhausted, his face pale and his body swaying slightly as if he might collapse. She moved to support him and was shocked to find that his skin was cold. Not just cool, but cold like he'd been standing outside in winter weather. She wrapped her shawl around him and led him from the room, while the Whitfield family and Dr. Hutchinson remained focused on Eleanor. Everything happened exactly as Isaac had described. Within an hour, Eleanor's fever began to drop. By morning it had broken completely, and the child was sleeping peacefully instead of thrashing in delirium. By afternoon she woke up weak but coherent, asking for water and food. By the following day she was sitting up in bed, color returning to her cheeks, asking when she could go outside and play with her toys. Within a week she had made a complete recovery, showing no lasting effects from an illness that typically killed or permanently damaged those who survived it. Dr. Hutchinson was baffled. In his private notes he wrote, "I cannot explain the recovery of Miss Eleanor Whitfield. By all medical knowledge and experience, she should have died." The fever had reached a critical level. Her body showed signs of systemic failure, and I had exhausted all available treatments. Yet within hours of the Collins boy touching her, the fever began to subside. I witnessed this with my own eyes, yet I cannot provide any rational medical explanation for what occurred. The boy did nothing that resembles any healing practice I have studied. He simply stood there with his hands on her forehead, and somehow, impossibly, the fever left. If I had not witnessed this myself, I would dismiss it as superstition or coincidence. But I was there. I saw it happen, and I am forced to conclude that this child possesses some capability that medical science does not currently understand or possess the vocabulary to describe. Thomas Whitfield's response to his daughter's miraculous recovery was complex and revealing of the contradictions inherent in the slaveholding South. He was grateful, genuinely grateful that Isaac had saved Eleanor's life. But he was also deeply uncomfortable with the implications of an enslaved child possessing abilities that exceeded white medical expertise. His solution was to keep Isaac close while simultaneously trying to control and limit his gift. Whitfield removed Isaac from field work and made him a personal attendant, a position that gave the boy better food, better clothing, and better living conditions than most enslaved people on the plantation. But this privilege came with restrictions. Isaac was forbidden from healing anyone without Whitfield's explicit permission. He was not allowed to discuss his abilities with other enslaved people. He was kept under constant supervision to ensure he didn't use his gift in ways that might undermine plantation authority or create discontent among the enslaved population. Ruth Henderson's journals from this period reveal the psychological toll this isolation took on young Isaac. "The boy is changing," she wrote in 1858. "He's always been quiet, but now he's withdrawn in a way that worries me. He spends hours alone, avoiding contact with other people. He won't let anyone touch him, pulls away from hugs, won't shake hands, keeps distance between himself and everyone else. When I ask him why, he says touching people is dangerous, that he feels their sickness even when they're not sick yet, that sometimes he sees how they're going to die and he doesn't want to know these things. He's only 8 years old, but he carries a burden that would crush a grown man." Despite Whitfield's attempts to control Isaac's healing ability, word spread through the enslaved community about the boy who could cure fevers. People began seeking him out, risking punishment to ask for his help when family members fell ill. Isaac tried to help when he could, sneaking away from supervision to touch the hands of sick children, to whisper his strange healing words over fevered adults. Ruth documented 19 such healings in a small brown notebook, recording the names of those who were cured, the dates of the healings, and brief descriptions of the circumstances. The healings Ruth documented between 1857 and 1860 followed consistent patterns that suggested Isaac's ability was genuine rather than coincidental. Each healing involved direct physical contact, Isaac placing his hands on the sick person's forehead, chest, or hands. Each healing lasted between 3 and 7 minutes, during which Isaac would close his eyes and appear to be concentrating intensely. Witnesses consistently reported feeling a change in temperature during the healing. The room would grow warmer, and heat seemed to radiate from Isaac's body. And each healing resulted in dramatic improvement within hours, followed by complete recovery within days. But there was a cost to these healings that became increasingly apparent as Isaac grew older. After each healing session, Isaac would become exhausted and physically ill. He would turn pale, his skin growing cold to the touch, despite the heat that had radiated from him during the healing. He would often vomit, his body shaking with tremors that lasted for hours. He would sleep for extended periods, sometimes 14 or 15 hours straight, as if the healing had drained something essential from him that needed to be slowly replenished. Ruth Henderson observed this pattern with growing concern. "It's like the sickness tries to get into him," she wrote in her journal in 1859. "When he heals someone, especially someone who's very sick, it's like the fever attempts to jump from the sick person into Isaac. But it can't take root in him. His body rejects it somehow. That rejection is what exhausts him. He's fighting off diseases that should kill him, over and over again, every time he heals someone. I've tried to tell him to stop, that he's damaging himself, but he says he can't stop. He says when he touches a sick person, he feels the fever inside them calling to him, and he has to answer that call. He has to help the fever leave, even though doing so hurts him." The physical toll on Isaac became more noticeable as the frequency of healings increased. By 1860, when Isaac was 10 years old, he looked older than his years, thin, with dark circles under his eyes, his face drawn with exhaustion that never fully left him even after days of rest. The heat that had made him warm to the touch as an infant seemed to be consuming him from the inside. burning through his energy reserves faster than they could be replenished. Ruth worried that Isaac was slowly killing himself through his healings, that each fever he drew out of someone else took a piece of his own life force that could never be recovered. The most documented and controversial healing occurred in 1860, involving a man who had been Isaac's most vocal critic, the Reverend Joseph Reed, pastor of the Liberty County Baptist Church that served the white community. Reverend Reed had preached multiple sermons condemning Isaac as an instrument of the devil, claiming that his healing abilities were not gifts from God, but rather manifestations of dark magic or witchcraft. In Reed's theology, enslaved people were inherently inferior beings, and the idea that a black child could possess healing powers that exceeded white medical knowledge was not just impossible, but blasphemous. "That boy is not of God," Reverend Reed thundered from his pulpit in a sermon recorded in the church minutes from April 1860. "No child of Ham can possess such abilities through righteous means. If he heals through darkness, through powers that come from below rather than from above. I warn this congregation, do not seek his help, do not acknowledge his claimed abilities, for to do so is to traffic with forces that will damn your eternal souls. The natural order established by God places the Negro beneath the white man, and any suggestion that a Negro child could possess powers that white physicians do not have is an offense against God's ordained hierarchy." 1 week after delivering this sermon, Reverend Reed fell violently ill with what appeared to be typhoid fever. He developed high fever, severe abdominal pain, and the characteristic rose-colored spots on his chest that marked the disease. Liberty County had no resident physician at the time. Dr. Hutchinson had moved to Savannah, and the nearest doctor was more than a day's travel away. For 3 days, Reverend Reed's condition deteriorated rapidly. His wife, Martha Reed, tried every home remedy she knew, but the fever continued to climb and her husband's lucidity faded in and out. On the 4th day, with her husband barely conscious and clearly dying, Martha Reed made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. She sent a message to the Whitfield plantation begging for Isaac Collins to come heal her husband. The request put Thomas Whitfield in a difficult position. Reverend Reed had been clear in his condemnation of Isaac. Sending the boy to heal the minister would essentially be admitting that Reed's theology was wrong, that a black child could indeed possess God-given healing abilities. But Martha Reed was desperate, and Whitfield had seen Isaac's healing power work too many times to dismiss it as anything other than genuine. Whitfield sent Isaac to the Reed home, accompanied by Ruth Henderson. When they arrived, they found Reverend Reed in a state of near-death delirium, his temperature dangerously high, his body racked with the tremors and disorientation that marked advanced typhoid. Martha Reed met them at the door, her face wet with tears, her hands shaking. "Please," she said to Isaac, this white woman begging a 10-year-old enslaved boy for help. "Please save him. I know what my husband said about you. I know he called you evil. But please, if you can help him, I'm begging you to do so." Isaac looked at her with those dark, observant eyes that had seen so much suffering in his young life. "I don't heal because people deserve it," he said quietly. "I heal because the fever calls to me and I have to answer. Your husband's words about me don't matter. His fever matters. That's what I respond to." He entered the house and approached the bed where Reverend Reed lay unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Isaac placed both hands on the minister's forehead and closed his eyes in that characteristic posture of concentration that marked his healing sessions. Ruth Henderson later recorded what happened in detailed notes that she included in her brown notebook. "The room grew warmer immediately," she wrote. "I could feel heat radiating from Isaac's body like he was a stove that someone had stoked. The child stood perfectly still for maybe 5 minutes, not moving, barely breathing, completely focused on whatever he was doing. Then he spoke in that strange voice he uses during healings, the voice that sounds older than any 10-year-old should sound. He said, 'The fever is deep and strong. It's wrapped around his organs like vines around a tree. But it can be loosened. It can be pulled free. I'm asking it to leave now. I'm pulling it out." Isaac's body started shaking, trembling like he was cold even though the room was warm. Then he said, "It's leaving. The fever is coming out. By morning he'll sleep without the delirium. By tomorrow night, the worst will be past. In a week, he'll be weak but alive. This is what will happen." Isaac removed his hands from Reverend Reed's forehead and immediately collapsed. Ruth caught him before he hit the floor and was shocked by how cold his body had become. "It was like holding ice," she wrote. "The boy was shaking so hard I thought he might be having a seizure. His skin was pale as death, and his lips had gone almost blue. I wrapped him in blankets and held him until the shaking stopped, and he finally fell into an exhausted sleep. This was the worst I'd ever seen him after a healing. Whatever poison or sickness was in Reverend Reed, pulling it out nearly killed Isaac. I sat there holding that child and crying, because I could see that this gift was destroying him piece by piece, healing by healing. Everything happened exactly as Isaac had predicted. By morning, Reverend Reed's fever had begun to drop, and the delirium had faded into natural sleep. By the following evening, he woke coherent for the first time in days, weak but clearly past the crisis point of the disease. Within a week, he was able to sit up in bed and take solid food. Within 2 weeks, he was conducting church services again, though in a much subdued manner. Reverend Reed never preached another sermon condemning Isaac Collins. In fact, he never mentioned Isaac from the pulpit again. The church minutes contain only one cryptic reference to the healing, a note written in Reed's own hand in the margin of the page recording services from May 1860. He came from the silence and must return to the silence when it is his time. What Reed meant by this statement, and what he truly believed about Isaac after being healed by the boy he had called an instrument of the devil, remains unknown. But the fact that he never again spoke against Isaac suggests that the experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of something, either about Isaac specifically, or about his own theology more generally, or about the nature of divine gifts and how they might manifest in people his society taught him to view as inferior. By 1861, Ruth Henderson had documented 19 healings in her brown notebook, 19 people who had been cured of fevers and infections that should have killed them, all through Isaac Collins's mysterious touch. The notebook contained names, dates, and brief descriptions of symptoms and outcomes. It was the most systematic documentation of Isaac's abilities, the closest thing to a scientific record of what he could do. Ruth kept the notebook hidden, aware that if the wrong people knew about the extent of Isaac's healing powers, he might be taken away, sold to someone who would exploit him, or worse. The names in Ruth's notebook told stories of a community surviving against terrible odds. There was Robert Hale, the first documented healing, who lived until 1889 and always credited Isaac with saving his life. There was little Margaret Williams, age 6, who recovered from scarlet fever after Isaac touched her forehead and whispered that she had more years to live. There was old Samuel Jackson, who everyone thought was dying of pneumonia, but who recovered after Isaac sat beside him for an hour, hands on the old man's chest, drawing the infection out. There was Eleanor Whitfield, the plantation owner's daughter, whose recovery had changed Isaac's circumstances, but also isolated him further from his community. Each name represented not just a life saved, but also a piece of Isaac taken, energy expended, warmth given, some essential vitality transferred from his body to theirs. Ruth could see Isaac changing with each healing, growing more withdrawn, more exhausted, more desperate to avoid the touch that would reveal another person's sickness to him. "The gift is eating him alive," Ruth wrote in her journal in late 1860. "Every healing takes more from him than the one before. His body is trying to keep up, trying to regenerate whatever he gives away, but it can't keep pace. I'm watching a child burn himself out trying to save others, and I don't know how to stop it. I don't know if it can be stopped." The Civil War began in April 1861, and life on the Whitfield plantation changed dramatically. Thomas Whitfield joined the Confederate Army as an officer, leaving the plantation in the care of his wife Eleanor, and an overseer named Marcus Drummond, who was known for his cruelty. With Thomas Whitfield away, some of the protection that had surrounded Isaac dissolved. Drummond viewed Isaac with suspicion and resentment, seeing the boy's special status as an affront to the proper order of plantation hierarchy. Drummond had heard the stories about Isaac's healing abilities, but he dismissed them as superstition and trickery. "That boy ain't special," he told the other white employees on the plantation. "He's just a slave who's gotten above himself, who's been coddled by Master Whitfield until he thinks he's something more than property. I'll knock that nonsense out of him quick enough." Drummond began subjecting Isaac to harsher treatment, assigning him difficult physical labor, denying him the better food he'd been receiving, restricting his movements around the plantation. Things came to a head in the summer of 1862 when Drummond himself fell ill with a severe fever. Delirious and desperate, he demanded that Isaac heal him. But for the first time, Isaac refused. "I can feel your fever," Isaac told the overseer, his voice steady despite his fear of the consequences of defiance. "But I also feel your heart. You're not sick in your body only. You're sick in your soul. You enjoy causing pain. You like hurting people. The fever in you is partly your own cruelty eating you from the inside. I won't heal that. I won't help you live so you can keep hurting my people." Drummond was enraged by this refusal, but he was also too sick to immediately retaliate. He survived the fever through conventional means. It took weeks of suffering, but his body eventually fought off the infection on its own. Once he recovered, Drummond made Isaac's life as difficult as possible. The boy was subjected to beatings for minor infractions, given the hardest labor assignments, and kept under constant surveillance. Ruth Henderson watched with growing fear as Isaac withdrew further into himself, speaking less, eating less, spending whatever free time he had sitting alone and staring at nothing. "The boy is breaking," Ruth wrote in her journal in late 1862. "The gift that was supposed to be a blessing has become a curse. He told me yesterday that he can feel fevers in people before they even know they're getting sick. He says it's like hearing voices calling to him all the time, asking for help, begging to be released from bodies they're infecting. He said he's tired of the voices. He said he wants silence. I'm worried about what he means by that. I'm worried that Isaac is thinking about ways to make the voices stop permanently." The war ground on, bringing hardship and disruption to the plantation. Food became scarce. Medical supplies disappeared. Diseases that had been manageable became deadly again, without access to physicians or medicine. The enslaved community suffered disproportionately as they always did, bearing the greatest burdens with the fewest resources. Isaac's gift became both more valuable and more dangerous. Valuable because there was no other source of healing available, dangerous because using it continued to drain him of whatever reserves kept him functioning. In 1863, a particularly severe outbreak of fever swept through the slave quarters. Within a week, 12 people were sick, and without intervention, several would certainly die. The community came to Isaac, begging for his help despite knowing how much it cost him. Isaac looked at the sick people, felt the fevers burning in their bodies, heard the silent calls for help that only he could perceive. And despite his exhaustion, despite his deteriorating health, despite his desperate desire to stop using the gift that was destroying him, Isaac couldn't refuse. He spent 3 days moving from cabin to cabin, touching fevered foreheads, whispering his healing words, drawing sickness out of bodies and bearing the cost in his own flesh. By the end of the 3rd day, all 12 sick people were recovering. But Isaac collapsed, his body pushed beyond its limits. For 2 days he lay unconscious, his skin cold as ice, his breathing so shallow that Ruth feared he had finally burned out completely. When he finally woke, he looked like a ghost, pale, thin, his eyes sunken and dull. "I can't do this anymore," he told Ruth when he regained consciousness. "Every healing takes a piece of me that I can't get back. I'm disappearing, Ruth. Every time I pull fever out of someone else, I leave a piece of myself behind. Pretty soon there won't be enough of me left to function. The gift is killing me, I know that now. And I don't know how to stop it except to stop healing people, but I can't do that either. When I feel the fever in someone and I don't respond, it's like ignoring someone screaming for help. I can't live with that. But I also can't keep living like this. Ruth held Isaac while he spoke, feeling how thin he had become, how frail. This child, who had been born with unusual warmth, who had never been sick a day in his life, was being consumed by the very gift that made him extraordinary. "Maybe we can find a way to protect you," Ruth suggested. "Maybe if you heal less frequently, give your body more time to recover between sessions." But Isaac shook his head. "It doesn't work like that. The fever calls don't wait for convenient times, and the longer I ignore them, the louder they become. It's like they're building up inside my head, pressing against my skull, demanding to be answered. The only time I have peace is right after a healing, those few hours before my body starts recovering, and I can hear the calls again. I'm trapped, Ruth. I'm trapped by a gift I never asked for and can't control." In 1865, the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. The Whitfield plantation, like most Southern agricultural operations, was in ruins. Thomas Whitfield returned from the war, physically intact but psychologically changed by what he had witnessed and participated in. The enslaved people on his plantation were now legally free, though freedom came with its own challenges. No land, little money, nowhere to go in a society that was hostile to black independence. Many formerly enslaved people stayed on the Whitfield plantation as sharecroppers or wage laborers, having few better options available. Isaac, now 15 years old, stayed as well, living in the same cabin he had occupied during slavery, continuing to serve as an informal healer for the black community, though he no longer had any official position. The physical toll of years of healing was evident in his appearance. He looked older than his years, worn down by the accumulated cost of saving others. It was during this period that Isaac came to the attention of Dr. Milton Grant, a Union Army physician who had come south as part of the Freedmen's Bureau's effort to provide medical care and assistance to formerly enslaved people. Dr. Grant was stationed in Liberty County, tasked with establishing a medical clinic and training local people in basic healthcare practices. When he heard stories about Isaac Collins, a young man who could cure fevers through touch, he was skeptical but curious enough to investigate. Dr. Grant met with Isaac in the fall of 1866 and requested permission to examine him and observe his healing abilities. Isaac, now old enough to make his own decisions, was initially reluctant. "I don't know if I want to be studied like a specimen," he told Dr. Grant. "I've spent my whole life being treated as property. I'm not eager to be treated as a curiosity." But Dr. Grant was persistent and, more importantly, respectful. He didn't demand access or claim authority over Isaac. He simply asked, and he explained that understanding Isaac's abilities might help other people. "If I can figure out how you do what you do," Dr. Grant explained, "maybe I can teach other doctors. Maybe we can develop treatments based on whatever mechanism allows you to heal fevers. You could help thousands of people instead of just the individuals you can personally touch." This argument appealed to Isaac's fundamental nature. He was someone who had always felt compelled to help, even when helping cost him dearly. He agreed to let Dr. Grant examine him and observe several healing sessions. What Dr. Grant documented over the course of several weeks was both fascinating and deeply puzzling. He measured Isaac's body temperature at rest and found it to be normal, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But during healing sessions, Isaac's temperature would rise dramatically. Dr. Grant recorded instances where Isaac's skin temperature climbed to 100.5 degrees Fahrenheit during the act of healing, measured with a calibrated mercury thermometer. Then, immediately after the healing was complete, Isaac's core body temperature would drop to as low as 95 degrees, well below normal, before gradually returning to baseline over the course of several hours. The temperature fluctuations are impossible by conventional medical understanding, Dr. Grant wrote in his report. The human body does not voluntarily spike and drop temperature in this manner. Yet I have measured it repeatedly with calibrated instruments, and the readings are consistent. During healing, Collins's body generates heat that seems to transfer to the patient. After healing, his body temperature drops precipitously, as if the energy required for healing has been drawn from his own thermal reserves. I have no explanation for how this occurs or what biological mechanism would allow such extreme temperature regulation. Dr. Grant also observed the effects of Isaac's healing on patients with active infections. He brought Isaac several people suffering from various fever-producing illnesses and monitored their conditions before and after Isaac's interventions. In every case, patients showed dramatic improvement within hours of Isaac touching them. Fevers broke faster than normal recovery would predict. Symptoms resolved more quickly than conventional treatment would achieve. And there were no relapses. Once Isaac healed someone, they stayed healed. I cannot explain the mechanism by which Collins achieves these results, Dr. Grant wrote in his official report. He does not administer any medicine. He does not perform any physical manipulation of the body beyond placing his hands on the patient. He speaks quietly during the healing process, but the words seem irrelevant to the outcome. I have observed healings where he said nothing at all, and the results were identical to sessions where he spoke continuously. The only consistent factors are physical touch, duration of contact, typically 3 to 7 minutes, and Collins's apparent concentration during the process. I am forced to conclude that something in or emanating from Collins's body affects the disease process in ways that current medical science cannot measure or explain. Dr. Grant attempted various experiments to understand the limits and mechanisms of Isaac's ability. He tested whether distance mattered. Could Isaac heal someone without direct touch, simply by being near them? The answer appeared to be no. Physical contact seemed essential. He tested whether Isaac could heal non-fever illnesses, injuries, chronic conditions, diseases without significant fever components. Again, the answer was no. Isaac's gift seemed specifically limited to fever-producing infections. He tested whether Isaac's state of mind affected the healing. Was concentration necessary, or would the healing work even if Isaac was distracted or unwilling? This question proved harder to answer, but Isaac insisted that intention mattered, that he had to consciously engage with the fever and ask it to leave. There's a communication that happens, Isaac tried to explain to Dr. Grant during one of their many conversations. When I touch someone who's sick, I can feel the fever inside them. It's like a presence, almost like it's alive in some way. I have to connect with it, acknowledge it, and then ask it to leave. Sometimes it leaves easily, like it was just waiting for permission. Other times it fights to stay, and I have to pull harder, which is when the healing exhausts me most. I don't understand the mechanism any better than you do, Dr. Grant. I just know that this is what happens when I use the gift. Dr. Grant's report, filed as Phenomenon 72 Collins in November 1866, was detailed, systematic, and professionally written. It included temperature measurements, patient case studies, observations of healing sessions, and Dr. Grant's own theories about possible mechanisms. He concluded, Isaac Collins represents either an unprecedented biological anomaly or evidence of healing capabilities that exist beyond current medical understanding. If the former, studying his physiology, might reveal new information about human thermoregulation and immune system function. If the latter, acknowledging his abilities, might require expanding our medical framework to include phenomena that cannot yet be explained through conventional science. Either way, Collins deserves further study, though such study must be conducted with his full consent and with respect for his humanity. He is not a specimen to be dissected, but a person with extraordinary abilities who has already paid a terrible price for using those abilities to help others. The report generated some initial interest among medical researchers in the North. Several physicians wrote to Dr. Grant requesting more information or asking to meet Isaac themselves. But before any systematic follow-up could be arranged, the report disappeared from the Union Army Medical Curiosities Archive. When Dr. Grant inquired about its whereabouts in 1875, he was told that no such report could be located, that perhaps he was misremembering which archive he had filed it in. The disappearance was never explained, though Dr. Grant suspected that someone with authority had decided that documentation of a black man with seemingly miraculous healing abilities was too politically or socially disruptive to keep in official records. The psychological burden of Isaac's gift grew heavier as he moved into late adolescence and early adulthood. Ruth Henderson's journals from this period paint a picture of a young man increasingly overwhelmed by abilities he couldn't control and couldn't turn off. Isaac barely speaks anymore, Ruth wrote in 1867. He's built walls around himself that even people who love him can't penetrate. He won't let anyone touch him, pulls away from even casual contact like it burns him. He says he can feel the sickness in everyone, that even healthy people carry the seeds of future fevers in their bodies, and touching them means feeling those seeds starting to grow. He said something yesterday that frightened me. He said, "The fever is in the words, not just in the body. Sometimes I see it before it manifests, and I don't want to feel anything anymore." Isaac began actively avoiding people, spending more and more time alone. He would disappear for hours or even days, walking through the woods and fields around Liberty County, seeking solitude where he couldn't hear the silent calls of fevers waiting to manifest in bodies not yet showing symptoms. He stopped healing people, even when asked directly for help. "I'm tired," he would say when approached by someone with a sick family member. "I've given enough. I need to rest." The community understood, or tried to, but there was also resentment from some who felt Isaac was selfishly withholding a gift that could save lives. "They don't understand," Isaac told Ruth during one of their increasingly rare conversations. "They see someone sick, and they think I can just touch them and make it better, like it costs me nothing. But every healing leaves me emptier. Every fever I draw out takes something from me that I can't recover. I'm not refusing to help because I don't care. I'm refusing because if I don't stop, there won't be anything left of me. The gift will consume me completely, and then I'll be gone, and there'll be no one to heal anyone." The last documented healing Isaac performed occurred in early 1868, when Ruth Henderson herself fell ill with pneumonia. She had been like a mother to Isaac, the person who had cared for him and protected him throughout his childhood and adolescence. When she collapsed with fever and difficulty breathing, Isaac came to her side despite his exhaustion and his commitment to stop using his gift. "He looked so tired," Ruth wrote in her journal after recovering, one of the final entries she would make about Isaac. "His face was drawn, his eyes had dark circles under them like he hadn't slept in weeks. But he touched my forehead with those warm hands of his, and I felt the fever start to loosen its grip. He whispered, 'Not your time yet, Ruth. You have more to do before you can rest.' Within hours, I could breathe easier. Within days, I was recovering. But Isaac looked worse after healing me than I had looked when I was sick. He was pale and cold and shaking. He slept for 2 full days. When he woke up, he told me that was the last time. He said he couldn't do it anymore. He said the gift was eating him alive from the inside, and he needed to find a way to silence it before it destroyed him completely. In March of 1868, just weeks after healing Ruth Henderson, Isaac Collins disappeared. He was last seen walking along the banks of the Medway River at dawn by a free black man named Carter Wilkes. Carter later reported the encounter to Ruth Henderson, describing what would be the final known sighting of Isaac Collins. "I saw Isaac standing by the water," Carter told Ruth, his voice heavy with concern. He was just standing there, staring out at the river like he was trying to decide something important. I called out to him, asked if he was all right. He turned to me slow, like he'd been somewhere far away in his mind. His eyes looked empty, Ruth, like something that used to be in him had gone away. He said to me, "I'm hearing the fever of the whole world, Carter. Every sickness, every infection, every death by disease, I can hear all of them calling to me. The gift that was supposed to help people is drowning me. I need to find silence." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and started walking south along the river. That was the last I saw of him. Isaac Collins was never seen again. The formerly enslaved community in Liberty County searched for him for weeks, but found no trace. No body was discovered in the river or in the woods. No reports of Isaac appeared from neighboring counties or states. He simply vanished, as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Theories about what happened to Isaac proliferated in the community. Some believed he had drowned himself in the river, seeking the silence he had spoken of by ending the life that had become unbearable. Others believed he had walked away to start a new life somewhere far from Georgia, somewhere he could escape his reputation and his gift. A few believed something stranger, that the gift had finally consumed him entirely, that his body had literally burned itself out in the service of healing others, and that he had simply dissolved into the landscape like morning mist. Ruth Henderson searched for Isaac for years, making inquiries throughout Georgia and beyond, following up on any rumor that sounded like it might be about him. But she never found him. Her brown notebook, the precious record of 19 healings that proved Isaac's gift was real, remained her most treasured possession, proof that Isaac Collins had existed and had done extraordinary things. In 1872, tragedy struck that would erase even this evidence. A fire broke out in Ruth Henderson's cabin on a night when a partial solar eclipse occurred, a strange coincidence that some in the community saw as ominous. The fire consumed everything in the cabin, including Ruth's journals and her brown notebook. Ruth herself barely escaped with her life, suffering burns that would trouble her for the rest of her days. The loss of the notebook devastated Ruth. Without it, without the systematic documentation of Isaac's healings, his story would become just another tale passed down orally, subject to the distortions of memory and the skepticism of those who hadn't witnessed what he could do. Ruth survived the fire but was never quite the same afterward. She lived until 1891, and in her final years, she would tell stories about Isaac Collins to anyone who would listen. She described his healings in detail, named the people he had saved, insisted that every word she spoke was true. But without the notebook, without physical evidence, her stories were just stories, accounts that could be dismissed as the exaggerations of an elderly woman whose memory might not be entirely reliable. The historical record of Isaac Collins is frustratingly sparse beyond Ruth Henderson's testimony and Dr. Milton Grant's disappeared report. He appears in the Whitfield Plantation's slave inventory records as Isaac, born March 1850, Mother Sarah, deceased. He appears in Freedmen's Bureau records from 1866 as Isaac Collins Freedman, age 16, residing Liberty County, occupation general laborer. A few other documentary fragments mention him in passing. A letter from Thomas Whitfield to his wife mentioning the boy who helped Eleanor recover. A church record noting that Reverend Reed was mysteriously healed after a severe illness. But there are no photographs of Isaac, no letters written by him, no detailed personal accounts in his own words describing what it felt like to possess his gift and bear its burden. What we're left with are fragments, pieces of a story about a boy who could cure fevers without medicine, who never got sick himself, whose body temperature would rise during healings and then plummet afterward, who felt the presence of disease in people before they showed symptoms and who ultimately disappeared, overwhelmed by a gift that isolated him from normal human connection and demanded more from him than he could continue to give. In 1921, more than 50 years after Isaac Collins disappeared, a researcher working in the archives of the American Missionary Association found a slip of paper tucked into a box of miscellaneous documents from the Reconstruction era. The paper was yellowed and brittle, and it bore a single handwritten line, "Isaac Collins, the boy who warmed life." There was no signature, no date, no context that would explain who wrote this statement or why. The handwriting was neat and educated, suggesting someone with formal schooling, but it matched no known correspondence in the archive. The paper was simply there, a fragment of testimony from someone who had known Isaac or known of him, someone who wanted to preserve some small memory of what he had been able to do. The boy who warmed life. It's a beautiful phrase, and it captures something essential about Isaac Collins that clinical descriptions and medical documentation miss. Isaac didn't just cure fevers. He warmed life back into bodies that were growing cold with disease, brought vitality back to people who were fading toward death. His gift was fundamentally about life asserting itself over illness, warmth overcoming the coldness that serious fever paradoxically brings despite the burning temperature. But the phrase also hints at the tragedy of Isaac's story. He warmed other people's lives while his own life grew colder, more isolated, more burdened by the demands of a gift he never asked for and couldn't fully control. Every healing took warmth from him, literal thermal energy according to Dr. Grant's measurements that needed time and rest to replenish. And as the healings accumulated, as the years passed and the demands on him grew, Isaac found himself growing colder in ways that went beyond physical temperature. The human warmth of connection, of being touched and valued for who he was rather than what he could do, became impossible for him. Touch meant feeling other people's sickness. Proximity meant hearing the calls of fevers waiting to manifest. Even love became complicated when loving someone meant potentially feeling them die long before their time actually came. Modern medicine still cannot explain Isaac Collins. The phenomenon of therapeutic touch has some scientific support. Studies have shown that human touch can reduce stress hormones, promote healing responses, and provide measurable health benefits. But nothing in current medical literature documents the kind of dramatic, immediate fever reduction that Isaac allegedly achieved. The temperature fluctuations Dr. Grant observed, rising during healing, dropping afterward, don't match any known physiological process. The ability to perceive disease before symptoms manifest would require sensory capabilities that neuroscience says humans don't possess. Various theories have been proposed. Perhaps Isaac possessed an extremely rare genetic mutation that affected his immune system and metabolic processes in unprecedented ways. Perhaps his body generated heat through some unknown mechanism and could transfer that heat to others in ways that affected their disease processes. Perhaps he had heightened olfactory or other sensory abilities that allowed him to detect chemical signals of infection that most people can't perceive. Perhaps his healings worked through psychological mechanisms, his touch and confident predictions triggering placebo responses powerful enough to affect actual disease outcomes. But these explanations feel inadequate when confronted with the historical evidence, fragmentary as it is. Isaac didn't just heal minor ailments that might respond to psychological factors. He healed scarlet fever, typhoid, severe pneumonia, diseases with high mortality rates even with modern antibiotics. His predictions about recovery timelines were consistently accurate, suggesting he perceived something about disease progression that went beyond educated guessing. And the physical toll healing took on him, the exhaustion, the hypothermia, the need for extended recovery, suggests something more than psychological placebo was at work. The truth is, we don't know how Isaac Collins did what multiple reliable witnesses claim he did. We don't know if his gift represented some capability that all humans possess but most never develop, or if he was a unique biological aberration, or if something stranger was at work. We don't know what happened to him after he disappeared in 1868, whether he found the silence he was seeking or whether that silence came through death. We don't know if others like him existed in history, their stories lost or suppressed because their abilities challenged prevailing medical and social understandings. What we do know is that his story matters. It matters because it reminds us that human biology may be capable of things we don't yet understand. It matters because it shows that extraordinary gifts often come with extraordinary costs. It matters because it preserves the memory of a black child born into slavery who possessed an ability that should have made him celebrated and protected, but instead made him isolated and burdened. It matters because Isaac Collins spent his brief time on Earth trying to help people, using his gift to ease suffering despite the personal cost, and that generosity deserves to be remembered, even when the mechanism behind it remains mysterious. And it matters because somewhere in that fragmentary historical record, somewhere in Ruth Henderson's memories and Dr. Milton Grant's lost report, and that mysterious slip of paper calling Isaac the boy who warmed life, there's a truth worth preserving, that healing is possible even when we don't understand how it works, that some people are born with gifts that transcend medical explanation, and that the world lost something valuable when Isaac Collins walked away seeking silence and was never seen again. His story challenges us to remain humble about the limits of our knowledge, to stay open to possibilities that don't fit neatly into current scientific frameworks, and to remember that human potential may extend far beyond what we currently recognize or accept. Isaac Collins may have found his silence more than 150 years ago, but his story continues to speak, asking us to wonder about the extraordinary capabilities that might exist in bodies and minds we've been taught to undervalue, and reminding us that the greatest mysteries are often the ones that wear human faces and walk among us unrecognized until circumstances force us to see them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Isaac Collins truly possessed the healing abilities described, or could there be alternative medical explanations for what witnesses reported? Have you heard stories in your own family about healers who seem to cure people through touch or presence, abilities that doctors couldn't explain? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts about this mysterious and moving chapter in Black American history. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more about extraordinary black people whose abilities challenged medical understanding and whose lives were shaped by gifts that society struggled to accept, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates mysteries that make us question the limits of human potential. Remember, some of the most remarkable people in history left barely a trace in official records, their stories preserved only in fragments and memories passed down through generations. Isaac Collins may have found his silence, but his story continues to speak, reminding us that healing takes many forms, that gifts come with costs, and that extraordinary abilities often burden those who possess them in ways the rest of us can never fully understand. See you in the next video, where we continue uncovering the hidden stories of remarkable people whose lives challenge us to expand our understanding of what human beings are truly capable of achieving.